of child support and reproductive rights seemingly skewed towards women. Well, it wasn't always this way.
Women's sexuality and reproduction has been very much controlled by men. There has been, and there still is, a lot of sexual violence. There was no effective contraception. Women would get pregnant. They would have to bear all the children that they had for the most part, or they would have to undertake abortions that weren't particularly safe. They would have to nurse their own children, and childbirth was so dangerous that usually it knocked them off at some point.
That's medical ethicist Dr. Leslie Cannold, and she says the concept of the biological dad paying child support was a political fix to save cash, and she reckons a really bad idea.
We now have this situation where more women who are having premarital sex are choosing to continue with the pregnancy and to become single mothers. But the problem was that there was a huge amount of poverty suffered by these families, not just families of single mothers and their children, but also divorced mothers. And in those situations, largely the men were leaving the family and were not really looking back. And so these families were living in terrible, terrible poverty. So the solution to that was what was called the single mother's pension. It's completely unacceptable to leave women and their children in poverty, but it was expensive. And so basically what happened is government started looking at this spiraling bill, and then someone got this light bulb idea that while not every child has a social father, every child has a biological father. So what they did was they said, we've got this new technology, which is DNA paternity testing. We now can know in a way that we never could before that a certain child is almost certainly the child of a particular man. So now we can hook up umbilically almost every child to a man's wallet. And that's where we got the situation we have now.
A lot of men see this as really unfair. How is it that this could have been brought in when men made up the bulk of the politicians and were making all of these decisions to change it?
Money, 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 money. It was all that money. If anybody had really been thinking about what was best for men, what was best for women, or what was best for children, this would have seemed like a really bad idea. But it certainly solves a financial problem. And there is a notion that's still out there that if you play, you should pay. Now, those ideas always used to apply to women. But now, all of a sudden, this same idea, I think, was being applied to men. So I think built into this idea is not just the fact that it was saving the state money, but this very punitive notion about playing and sex and appropriate punishments being children.
How can it be that you can have an anonymous sperm donor who doesn't have to pay child support, where a one-night stand who, may be virtually anonymous to the mother does?
Well, great question. And of course, that points out some of the inconsistencies in the law. You have what's called a donor situation, and the law clearly says a donor is not a father. But in every other situation, as you're rightly alluding to, the law now suggests that a father is the one who was there at the time of conception, not the one who's there for the 18 to 20 years after doing the hard work of parenting, but the father is the guy who gave the sperm. Now, I think that is probably the most insulting idea of all.
Do you see this changing in future? Is this unsustainable?
Well, unfortunately, I think it's very fiscally sustainable, and that's why I think we got it, and that's why I think we're going to have to be fighting in a much more concerted and directed way if we want to get rid of it. If it is the case, and I would like it to be the case, that people accept the responsibilities of parenthood in a voluntary, non-rescindable, so sort of a one-time only option to say, yes, I consent, I want to go forward and be the parent. And that's something that I think implicitly, when you talk about the unfairness of the situation, I think that's the nugget of what men are getting at, is that because the pregnancy is taking place in the woman's body, given one person has to make the decision, it has to be her. That means she essentially does get a choice once she realizes she's pregnant, and that's their way of saying, I consent. I consent to this pregnancy, but I also consent to becoming a parent of this child, or, to choosing adoption, which rarely happens. I think men want that capacity too, and I can't see any reason why they shouldn't have it around the same time to give that consent. And I feel like if we did do it that way, we would have less grumpy, resentful men. But the problem is, in order to do it that way, you need to accept that some men are going to say, no, I was there for the Sex Act. This is a child that if it comes into being will be biologically mine, but I don't want to parent this child. I'm leaving. And that means the state's going to have to step in and support that woman and her child if she decides to go forward.